And thank you for joining us for this incredibly important film. I am just honored to be here today with Heather White, who is the co-director and producer of COMPLICIT. She began working on COMPLICIT while a network fellow at Harvard University's Safra Center for Ethics, and she's the founder of verite.org.
Well, I got involved in doing the research for COMPLICIT back in 2012 when I received a book contract to go to China and do research on the rise of mega factories and huge cities that have been created in the southern part of China with 300,000 or more workers in single factories. And one of the areas of interest that I had was following up on a newspaper article I'd seen that talked about workers with occupational disease as a result of being exposed to toxic chemicals who'd fallen into comas, who were spending years at a time in the hospital recuperating from neurological damage. Yet we hadn't really seen very much about it in the media, and in running Verite for 10 years. This wasn't an issue that we ever encountered directly in the factories. And I found out during the course of doing the research for the film that it was because those workers were no longer in the factories, that they were in the hospitals. And we had no access to those workers while I was at Verite. Are you able to hear me okay?
I can hear you. I can hear you. So you were at Verite before and then began the film.
Yes, I was at Verite, ran the organization for 10 years, left, joined the group at Harvard. And while I was at Harvard doing research, I received the book contract and went over to China. I didn't know how long I was going to spend there. It turned out to be a 3-year-long project of tracking down workers, interviewing them and their families, trying to get access to the factories and learn more specifically about benzene and hexane and their irresponsible usage in factories making smartphones. We actually had interviewed a lot of workers who'd had injuries to their hands as well from making accessories to smartphones and iPad devices, but we ended up having to make a decision: were we going to focus on chemicals or were we going to focus on occupational injuries ultimately? And even though those workers were extremely heartbreaking in terms of their stories, because they were all very young and they'd lost their right hands in factories where they'd only worked for a shorter period of time as 3 days and as long as a few months was the maximum that we found. But we ended up having to focus on the chemicals because that was an easier, more likely to be successful ask of Apple in terms of the campaign that we wanted the film to help launch. Because it's easier to ask a company to discontinue use of 2 specific chemicals as part of a campaign as opposed to address the issue of occupational injury in general, because workers around the world are being exposed to very hazardous conditions, and corporations for decades have ignored the high rates of injuries in many industries. So that was how I got started on the project. I met my co-director, Lynn Zhang, in 2013, and we worked together on the film until early 2016 when we went into post-production. And the basic news about the workers in the film is that everybody's still alive and everybody's doing well. Well, it was very exciting that we were able to achieve great results with the initial trailer for COMPLICIT, which was 10 minutes long and was the basis for the initial campaign, working with Green America and China Labor Watch. Just as a result of the trailer being released, we were able to engage with Apple, and they agreed to ban the use of benzene and hexane, which was a terrific development. But unfortunately, because there's been a human rights crackdown in China over the last 5 years, we haven't been able to actually work with any NGOs to find out whether the implementation of the ban has been widespread, and if it's been extended to their second and third tier suppliers. Their notification was that the first tier suppliers, that's the companies that they have direct relationships with, were going to be covered by the ban, but they don't actually monitor their second and third tier suppliers. And because of the crackdown and the closing of so many groups that we were able to work with in the early part of the filming, we haven't been able to get back into the factories, and it's become too dangerous to try to do the types of interviews and the type of work that we were able to do at Verite, actually, over the previous 10 years. The situation in China has actually gotten much tighter in terms of the government repression of worker rights organizations, even organizations that are just trying to help workers who've been injured in the factories or who've been exposed to toxic chemicals. Those groups have all had to go underground, and the staff from those organizations have received a lot of harassment.
Yeah, that was a question in the chat as well. Were you ever threatened during this process? And tell us about that harassment also of the workers and of these groups who are helping workers.
Well, we were pretty safe during the course of the filming. My colleague and I didn't ever come under any direct threats. Fortunately, we'd both been doing that type of work in China for many years, and so we felt pretty comfortable in the arrangements that we made with the workers and their families. We didn't take any unnecessary risks. We did have one instance where the security from a hospital came in and locked the film crew in one of the workers' hospital rooms, but it all worked out, and they weren't detained, and they didn't call the police because they were trying to limit the access of people in the hospitals. And there's a lot of surveillance cameras actually in the hospitals. We tried to interview workers that had been poisoned in an apple factory by hexane that had received quite a bit of media attention. So we were following, trying to interview them. But there was so much security in the hospital and cameras in everybody's rooms that it was extremely difficult. And we finally did have an opportunity to interview the workers with a young intern that we had who presented herself as a college student and was able to pass through the nurses' scrutiny in order to spend a little time in the hospital. But that was the only time we were able to get in there, and we'd tried on 4 previous attempts. So they make it very difficult if they think you're a journalist or part of an organization that might be reporting out publicly. And then in terms of the workers that we interviewed, they'd all been exposed to some type of harassment once they got involved in activism. As you saw in the course of Complicit, both Yi Yeting and Xiaoya, the 17-year-old girl who'd been poisoned by hexane, along with almost 40 of her colleagues, they all became quite active, and they had to deal with harassment from their factory, which was responsible for paying their hospital expenses. They didn't pay all of them, unfortunately. And in the case of Xiaoya, she actually didn't get a final settlement from her factory because she'd used a fake ID and had been underage when she first started her job. And the factory made the claim that since she'd used a false identity document, that they didn't have to pay for the fact that she had gotten poisoned while she was working there. So, you know, that's just one example of the kind of challenges that workers have when they're dealing with such a repressive, authoritarian workplace as well as government. But in the case of Yi Yeting, he was evicted a couple of times from his home because of his activism. And our main contact, a wonderful man who had been helping the workers who had lost their hands in the factory. We ended up only including him in our long trailer initially because, as I mentioned, we ended up focusing on the chemicals as opposed to the injuries. But he was missing his right hand, having gotten an injury in his factory. A lot of the production processes get speeded up so as to try to be more productive and run the assembly lines for longer. And as a result, often the safety mechanisms get disabled on machinery, and that leads to a much higher incidence of people losing their hands. And in this case, our friend Panza, not only was he under constant threat from security guards, but he actually disappeared in June of 2013 when we were still filming, and we never saw him again. We never found him. His family was very concerned about what happened to him. I made some inquiries to try to find out if there were avenues through the State Department that we might be able to utilize to try to find him, but everything didn't work out in terms of our ability to identify what had happened to him. So that was very concerning, but it wasn't related to the work that we had been doing with him. He was on a regular basis working in the communities around the factory and trying to help workers get benefits and the insurance payments and have their injuries compensated. But people are literally risking their lives in doing this type of work.
I had my teenage daughters watch it, and I think I'm so thankful that you have this available and you're educating college students and high schoolers as well, so that we know who touched the phone before it came into our lives, or all of these devices that we have. What evidence is there that they're not using benzene and hexane, and how do you find that out?
Right now, because of the crackdown in China, we're not able to get any information out from the country, unfortunately. One of the great weaknesses of the regulations with respect to protections for consumers regarding electronic devices made overseas is that there's no testing and no requirements in terms of not using hazardous chemicals, what processes are used in the manufacture. So consumers are also at risk in terms of lack of protections. But in terms of COMPLICIT, we focused exclusively on the challenge and the issues that the workers are facing because that was the nature of the project. But there have been some great organizations such as Environmental Health Trust and others who are doing as much work as possible, looking at the impact on consumers of the radiation and the EMFs, the electromagnetic fields that the phones are generating. But in terms of the evidence that the factories are no longer using benzene and hexane, we just have to take the company's word for it. In the case of Samsung, for example, they haven't issued any statements specifically about benzene or N-hexane, but they did create an $80 million compensation fund for workers who had developed leukemia and other bloodborne illnesses from working in their factories. And they have a lot of production in South Korea and had been the target of very concerted efforts by local NGOs and families whose relatives had contracted leukemia, which is something that's not possible in China because of the communist government there. But still, it's very difficult for workers to access remediation and funds through the Samsung $80 million fund that they created. But at least it's there, and people have a channel and support in society. Journalists can report on the issue, et cetera, and put pressure on the company, and they have been somewhat successful.
When I went to complicitfilm.org, which has resources for everyone who's interested in learning more about what to do and more about the film, you had a video on modern slavery. And I would, this is something that we talk about as well at every stage of the life cycle, there are these human rights abuses and impacts that are unseen.
In that documentary that is available on YouTube under Modern Slavery in Your Devices, we're looking at the complete supply chain beginning in the Congo with the extraction of cobalt. Cobalt mining is very hazardous, and there's a lot of reporting that's been done, some really good documentation about the risks to workers. And the fact that they're using children in the mines there is something that is also an international scandal. There's currently a lawsuit that's been brought by Terry Collingsworth representing families of workers in the Congo who've died as a result of exposure to cobalt and other hazards in the mining process. That's the very first stage. And then the minerals, once they're extracted, are sold to Chinese trading companies that are based on site. They're based in Africa. And they then send the materials to China and other parts of the world where they're being assembled into the actual devices. And then they come to us and we utilize them. We use them because of planned obsolescence. We don't use them for very long, unfortunately. We're constantly being pressured for the new upgrade and the next model of these smartphones and other devices, which is very damaging to the environment in terms of how they're handled once we discard them. And we may think that we're dropping them off at a recycling center, or we're taking them back to a big box retailer that says they have a recycling program, but it's been shown over and over again that in fact, a lot of the so-called recycling programs just take the discarded devices to the port where they're shipped back to Asia, or they're shipped back to Africa, where they're worked on as e-waste. And communities are under tremendous threat in terms of the toxic fumes and the waste dumps that have huge waste dumps that have been created in many countries that are handling the reprocessing of the e-waste. And then once the more valuable components have been removed, then they're recycled and taken back into the production chain. But the e-waste issue is one that's become very important for a lot of countries, and they're now starting to ban their imports. So for example, we used to send a lot of e-waste right back to China where the devices have been made, but they've put a ban out now. And so now a lot of the e-waste is going to other countries in Southeast Asia. And there's even been some documentation that Chinese companies are actually handling the dumping of the e-waste in Southeast Asia and places like Thailand and Malaysia. So ultimately, as consumers, we have to decide what kind of devices we want to use and how they're going to be made, because left to their own devices, the corporations are making some really catastrophic decisions in terms of the supply chain and how the devices are disposed of.
What can people do? How do they start addressing this issue to help to support fixing these issues as best they can? How would you list like the top 3 things and then go into more detail? I know this is a heavy lift, but we need to support what you're doing, and also to pressure companies to do better. How do we start, and where do we go to get involved?
Well, since everybody has a device, I assume at this point, something like 1.5 billion are sold every year now. The best thing we can do in terms of engaging directly with the producers of the devices that we're customers of is to write to the companies. They all have on their websites ways to contact them, ways to call them on the phone at their 800 numbers, their info at email addresses. They actually do pay attention to the letters that they get. And at one point during our campaign, I just called the customer service number at Apple a couple of times to engage with operators there to find out what they were saying about what they were hearing from consumers. And they said at
Mm-hmm.
the time, because the campaign was going, that in fact it was the #1 issue that they were hearing about from their customers.
Wow.
And they were logging in every call, and that they were assuming that for every call they received, there were 100 other people out there, other customers, who felt the same way but probably hadn't made the call. And they were reporting back up the chain to management about the concerns coming from customers. So we should never underestimate the potential impact, especially from students, because companies care a lot about college students and young people, because the literature on marketing and customer
Mm-hmm.
retention has shown that when a brand loses a young person as a customer as a result of some ethical issue or some negative publicity that they received, that they never return to that brand, that they refuse to buy
Wow.
that brand,
Mm-hmm.
for the rest of their lives. And so students have actually had a profound impact when they have campaigns. There was an organization called Students Against Sweatshops, for example, which had been very
Mm-hmm.
instrumental in the early days in raising issues around overseas supplier violations and the whole sweatshop phenomenon back in the 90s and the early 2000s. And those organizations, have been very influential. But yes, contacting the companies. If you see petitions online, it's great to sign them. It's great to support organizations that are doing activist work. Of course, with COVID, it's been a lot more challenging. And that's why would rate #1 is to contact the actual manufacturers directly, because um, the ability to do the kinds of advocacy work in the field, and also in terms of even the demonstrations that are occasionally held outside of the stores,
Mm-hmm.
has been highly constrained as a result of the events with the pandemic over the last 15 months. So I think from their homes, there's still things that can be done, phone calls that can be made, and emails that can be sent. And then not
So
to
contacting the companies, not
contacting
upgrading
companies,
unless you need to.
not upgrading. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just remaining aware as much as possible of what's happening in terms of the issues and support initiatives and advocacy efforts wherever you find them.
What are some of the organizations working on this issue?
Oh, well, I think your own organization's working on the issues around the hazards to consumers. Maybe you could tell the audience a little about your guys' own work, because that's how I found
Yeah,
out about you, is when I was reaching out to organizations like 5 years ago.
yes, I remember that. So we are working on the radiation, the health effects of the radiation, and have documented, and many of our scientists have published numerous studies on biological impacts, cancer from the wireless radiation. But Dr. Debra Davis, she has published several books, but of course worked on toxic chemicals and environmental health issues for many years before the focus right now on wireless radiation. So as I see it, for this film, for the Jackson Hole Environmental Health Film Festival, we wanted to have all these pieces about technology, because now with 5G, we're talking about billions. I think the estimate is 500 billion new wireless devices for the Internet of Things. So every device, there's the mining, there's the manufacturing, there's the use, the addiction. I mean, didn't even talk about all the other issues with consumers' use of devices. And then, of course, the e-waste and the recycling and the informal recycling and the burning of the chargers and the air pollution and the energy use. It's a lot, but we've got to just, I think, just take this head on and not be aware and call on manufacturers to do better. What can governments do? How do we support our governments in accountability for these companies, especially if they're transnational?
Yeah, I mean, I used to believe that nonprofits and civil society, trade unions had the ability to try to discipline corporations and corporate power on these issues. But as a result of working on Complicit over 5 years, I've come to the realization that the role for government, cannot be understated, and it's really important to try to get government as involved as possible. I've been to conferences where representatives from governments have actually stood up and said, we're going to leave this to the private sector. And I think that that's been disastrous in terms of what the impact on worker and the threat to consumer health has been. But there's, a trend in society for government to step back and to not regulate to the extent that is necessary when we're dealing with radiation and, an epidemic of worker exposure to toxic chemicals. In terms of the groups, though, that you asked about, we worked very closely with China Labor Watch and Green America. We're both based in the US. And there's also product take-back campaigns, which you can find out about on the web for your own local area and in your region. But that is an effort to put pressure on companies, the manufacturers, to actually take back the devices once consumers have finished with them, to try to create a more green life cycle for them and not just be discarded as e-waste. I think that that's a trend for the future, which hopefully will happen before we have many more, billions of tons of electronic waste generated from all of these devices in use. But the role for government, there's something called the bindingtreaty.org that you can read about online, which is an effort to actually make global corporations accountable for human rights violations that occur in their supplier networks around the world. So it doesn't matter where the activities take place, but if they're actually producing for a global brand, then the brand would be responsible for the activities and for the violations, which currently is not the case. Right now, there's no accountability. If it doesn't happen in the country where the corporation is headquartered, then there's basically no legal liability for what happens in their supply chain. And the case of Nigerian workers in the oil fields in the early 2000s, that was a very pivotal case in the Netherlands. It was the first time that a global corporation actually was found guilty of environmental degradation overseas. And so the lawyers who worked on that case, as well as the international community, are trying to create more of a legal precedent. And there's an effort in the EU Parliament with the binding treaty to also create legal accountability for what's happening in corporation supply chains, because their operations are all over the world now, and they're operating in so many countries that it's impossible to bring a case successfully forward unless something very major happens in terms of the international legal regulations and the regimes right now that try to maintain wherever possible protections for human rights and environmental standards.
So there's a couple questions in the chat that have to do with the phone and chemicals in the phone. If you take apart the phone, can you find the chemicals if you test them right there when you take it apart? And also, are any of those chemicals available, which there are many chemicals to the user when you use a phone that you can then be poisoned by as a consumer?
Well, in terms of the chemicals that were used in Complicit, those were solvents used to clean the devices as they travel through the assembly line. And these phones are being made by hand. So when I say travel through the assembly line, I mean they're basically moving from one workstation to another. And the benzene and the N-hexane are basically used to remove any traces of dust and to clean various component parts as they make their way through production. And the reason why the workers were so young and complicit is because often they present themselves to work at the factory. They might only be 16 or 17 years old. 18 is the legal working age in China, but often there's underage workers. Apple just had reports of workers as young as 14 in 2020. You know, this is years after they vowed that they were eliminating child labor from all of their suppliers in China, but it just didn't happen. But the youngest workers are the ones who are getting exposed to the most toxic solvents because they aren't skilled, they're not trained as engineers, they're basically just wiping stuff when they get these low-wage jobs in the factory that they can actually do when they're 15 or 16 years old. So those solvents dissolve over time, they evaporate. And so for the most part, as we did testing on several phones here that had just been purchased new, and found that they had the benzene and hexane or whatever chemicals were being used. There's over 500 chemicals that are being used in various ways in the assembly of smartphones, but we didn't find any trace residues of benzene or hexane. We only tested for them when we did the analysis, but the greatest risk is to the workers. But to respond to the person's question in the chat, what's happening that creates the hazard for consumers with the phones is that there are minerals that are heated up by the phone's operation. So for example, there's nickel, there's cadmium, there's a number of different minerals that are used in the production of the phone that are warmed when the phone is operating. And so, for example, the American Society of Pediatricians did some tests on toddlers and their exposure to iPads. And if there was any change in mineral levels in their blood, and they found that actually they started having spikes in their blood of nickel, which is a very toxic metal that children shouldn't be exposed to. So yes, but it's the usage of the device and the heat that's generated by their being on that creates the hazard to consumers, not the solvents that were used in the factory by the teenagers making the devices in China.
What about the depletion of natural resources from the manufacture of all of these devices?
Well, we're seeing a lot of deforestation around the world, and the mining situation with respect to the growing demand for electronic vehicles and electric batteries is, creating a lot of concern among advocacy organizations in Africa, where a lot of it's coming from. I mean, there are just massive mines that are being created. And of course, the environmental damage that's generated as a result of the mismanagement of how these mines are maintained by global corporations is a whole nother issue, and people are, I'm sure, making films about that as well.
There's so many topics, and each one is huge. I was reading something in your on the website page for the film, complicitfilm.org, and it was talking. It's one of the oldest and most well-known iPhone suppliers has been accused of using forced Muslim labor in its factories, according to documents uncovered by a human rights group. And I wondered if you could talk about that and where that is, or maybe as I was going down the links that you had on your site, is that still happening? And could you tell us more about that?
Well, it's very much a trending issue that's actually getting more attention by the month, as opposed to less, because there have been many allegations of the use of forced labor of the Uyghur ethnic minority in China. They live in the northwest region, which is actually the largest region geographically in China. Xinjiang in the northwest, and then also Tibet, which is in the far western region. Those are the two largest regions in terms of landmass in China. And the Turkish ethnic minority called Uyghurs, they're originally from Turkey, going way back to the time of the Silk Road, when people from Central Asia migrated to that area. They've been under a lot of repression and targeted by the Chinese government because they're Muslim. And as a result, there have been a lot of allegations that you can read about online of forced labor of up to 80,000 are estimated to have been forced to take jobs in factories all over China, not just in the region where they're located, which produces all the organic cotton for the country, as well as the majority of solar panels and polysilicon wafers, which are used in semiconductors. So these are, really big sectors of exports that have allegations of forced labor in them. And the governments of the US, the EU, UK, Australia have all started speaking out about it. Our new Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has called it a genocide, echoing what President Biden has also said, going back to what Trump was saying as well last year. So there's more attention now being brought to the issue. But the challenge for consumers is that we're buying products now that might have been made with conditions of modern slavery, and we can't do anything about it. We have no information. China doesn't allow any journalists to report on the issue. Journalists are trying to sneak in and get as much information and interviews as possible, but it's a highly risky environment, and most people aren't willing to take those kinds of risks. A lot of journalists have already been expelled from major news outlets. So this is a story that's definitely not one that China wants to be widely reported on, because it gives them a black eye. And a couple of brands that had language about forced labor on their websites actually got targeted by the Chinese government for domestic boycotts, with celebrities hired to criticize the brands. H&M was one, Nike was one, Adidas was one, and they responded by removing the offending language from their website. So now they don't have the websites with the language about forced labor or modern slavery anymore, because they didn't want to risk losing customers in China, which is not the type of leadership that I would like to see from our companies. But that's the reality. We can't really rely on them to take the high road. The only company that I've read about so far, which is interesting, that has actually publicly made a statement and sent a message to the suppliers that their orders are going to be discontinued, is McDonald's.
Wow. So where do we keep up with the news on this issue? What do you recommend so that we can stay up to date and also be aware of what campaigns are running and how to get involved?
Well, the websites for Green America, China Labor Watch are very informative. I mean, depending upon what your area of interest is, you can Google, Uyghur modern slavery, or go to the Guardian website, for example. They've had a lot of coverage on this topic. The BBC is reporting on it. CNN has done some major reporting on it. All the major news outlets are now covering it. Bloomberg, Business Insider, they all have had very interesting, credible reporting on the topic. So if people are interested, you can start out Googling it and then go to the credible news sites. There are some sites that are actually sponsored by the Chinese government, so you should probably avoid those. Websites such as Gray Matter and others that are sponsored or are official Chinese news outlets like China Daily are not likely to have as unbiased information because they're trying to push back on the allegations.
Are you doing any more films? Is there any new projects that you're working on?
Well, I've been working on a screenplay during COVID. I've been in lockdown outside of the US for almost 14 months. The lockdown's lifted, but we decided to stay through the summer. So I've been in the Caribbean for 14 months, and I started working on a screenplay that addresses some of the issues that we've been dealing with during COVID, as well as some of the issues around labor practices and supply chain issues.
I'm just honored to be talking to you and thankful that you are shedding a light and all the work that you've done. This is such an important film. If we wanted to share it in our school or in our community, we would go to Bullfrog Films to do what we just did now, to have a screening. And would you be available if people contacted you to set something up as well?
Either contact Bullfrog, Complicit is on their website, or they can reach me sending an email through our website at complicitfilm.org.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I think there's a lot of work to do. We have to demand better from companies and keep shining a light and getting transparency on what's actually going on. So we will
absolutely
be continuing to share this film and this Q&A so that people can learn more and share the trailer. And I thank you so much.
Thank you.
Did you know that cell phone, the one in your pocket, emits radio frequency radiation? As long as your phone's turned on, even if you're not talking or texting.
The American Academy of Pediatrics in over a dozen countries recommends reducing children's exposure to wireless radiation.
When using a cell phone, I always keep it away from my body. I use speakerphone or a headset like this.
To stop microwave exposure, I put my phone on airplane mode and turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth function.
I hold the phone at a distance and make sure it's not touching my body.
Cell phones are not toys. Children's brains and bodies are still developing and are vulnerable to wireless radiation. Practice safe and responsible habits with yourself and your children.
When using the computer, I always try to make sure my connection is corded, not wireless.
Remember not to use your cell phone in the car. The phone works at higher power in metal surroundings and bounces around, increasing your family's radiation exposure.
For their safety.
For your safety.
Because children are more vulnerable.
Remind them.
Remind yourself.
To limit your microwave radiation exposures. Probably the most important thing I did, I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I look at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities.
A growing number of prominent doctors and scientists are raising warning flags over radiation this morning, and your kids could be facing a greater risk of exposure.
I think the most important study is a study by the National Toxicology Program in a classic large carcinogenicity test, one of the largest ever performed, and for that matter, one of the most expensive. They found increased risk of the tumors which we believe radiofrequency radiation is causing in man. Particular tumors called schwannomas. In the rats, they were in the heart. In humans, they're often in the nerve, the ear nerve, the vestibular nerve.
Cell phone providers say they follow all safety guidelines put into place by the FCC. The current FCC safety standard was developed nearly 20 years ago.
The manufacturers actually tell people in the instruction manual, which I never read, not to put the cell phone against your ear.
It does say exactly that. There's the BlackBerry, for example, warns to keep your phone at least 0.98 inches away from the body when transmitting. With an iPhone, for example, it's 5/8 of an inch.
At this point, the evidence has become sufficiently strong that cell phone radiation is a human carcinogen. A major development from California's Department of Public Health. High use of cell phones may be linked to certain types of cancer and other health effects, including brain cancer and tumors, lower sperm counts, headaches, and effects on learning, memory, hearing, behavior, and sleep.
If it was a real problem, I would know. If it was a real problem, the government would protect us. How come I'm not hearing about this? They're all things I've heard when I give seminars. You know, I get up there and they say, oh yeah, if this was really a problem, they would have told us. I am they. I am a, legitimate scientist, and I am telling you.